Welcome to Spatial Signals. It's a podcast about remote sensing and geographic information systems, but more importantly, the people behind them. I'm your co-host, Dr. Brad Shellito, and with me today is your other co-host, coming to us from his pirate radio station at Donut Falls in Big Cottonwood Canyon, Mr. Chris McGinty. Chris, how are all those falling donuts at Utah treating you today?
The falling donuts are amazing. You can't get away from, you don't want to get away from falling donuts. I mean, it's kind of the best. It's the best thing about coming to Donut Falls, right? I mean,
sprinkles, applewood, apple fritters, cream sticks, all
everything.
Of them out there. Yes.
Oh yeah. How are things in Ohio today?
Oh, warm and sunny. We are so glad to have left the cold and snow in the far, far distant past over here.
Good. Well, that's, rather fight mosquitoes than snowflakes. So there you go.
Absolutely.
All right.
Well, for those of you just joining us, this podcast is sponsored by AmericaView, the National Geospatial and Remote Sensing Network dedicated to empowering Earth observation. Now, AmericaView has been around since 2003 and has grown from a program just within the state of sunny and definitely warm Ohio to a network of programs across the United States, working with remote sensing, GIS, and geospatial technologies in all forms of outreach, research, and education. But before I introduce today's very special guest, I'm going to kick things back to Chris with those bear claws for a little bit of the news.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I'm glad, we got through the donuts. We got through, the weather report. So now I can actually
most critical things of the show.
Yes. Right. Those are the important things. We're done. Yeah. No, we do have just a little bit of news today. It's actually kind of a cool little bite out of NASA and a company called TerraPulse. And may have definitely talked about NASA before. I don't know if we've mentioned TerraPulse.
NASA? No, I believe. Why don't you fill me in on that? I've heard.
I'm
that
not
word
going to
before,
fill us in on NASA today, but one of these days we will invite Dr. Joe Sexton from TerraPulse to come in and to talk with us. But today, talking a little bit about what their company has done, looking at Landsat data and over about 37 years of Landsat data, looking at changes in the world's largest terrestrial biome. And do you know what that largest terrestrial biome is, Brad?
Is it near Donut Falls?
It is not. I'm sorry.
Are there sprinkles on top?
It's further north, no sprinkles.
Glazed?
No glazed either. The boreal forest. So, I wanted to, bring this up because, we do talk a lot about Landsat. We do talk a lot about time series of data. So looking at how Landsat has mapped things through the many decades and, since 1972 to present, there's been a Landsat in orbit mapping and keeping an eye on what's happening on the surface of the Earth. And one of the things that's great about having this really long-term data set, Brad, is that we can start to look at how ecosystems and how terrestrial systems or non-terrestrial systems as well are changing through time. And this just happens to be a really great paper article that came out looking at the changes in this particular biome from 1985 to 2020. And really highlighting is the hypothesis was that this entire forest ecosystem, so this entire biome, is moving further north. And part of the reason that it is theoretically could be moving further north is because of changing global temperatures. And so what the team did, along with the folks at NASA, is look at this data. So they looked at 224,000 scenes over 30 plus years at 30-meter resolution, so the resolution of each pixel that Landsat maps. And what was really cool, and we'll provide the links to this, and there's a short 5-minute video that goes along with it, but essentially, not only is the boreal forest expanding by 12% over these 3 decades, 3+ decades, but also it's moving north. And what we're seeing there is moving north by roughly 30 to 40 miles, so about 60 kilometers, where it's pushed north. Permafrost is melting. It's becoming more reasonable for these trees to grow. And so what this is doing is it's really changing fire dynamics, number one, because this is a very fire-prone ecosystem. But also it's doing things with carbon capture that we didn't imagine before. And so because the forest is expanding, just in sheer size, we're seeing more carbon storage, but we're also seeing greater carbon output when we have these massive fires. And we've talked a little bit about that in past episodes. Folks can go back into the archive. But just a really neat little piece of information. Some of it shows the power of Landsat and some of these long duration missions that have been imaging the Earth for a long time. So we'll provide all those links, Brad. It's a really cool little story to go look at.
Yeah, make sure you go check out our companion Substack, where we'll put a link to this, despite the lack of donuts that are involved
No
here. We will
donuts.
be
I'm
having a link
sorry.
to NASA, particularly with the Scientific Visualization Studio, so you'll be
Yes.
able to look at some of these changes of boreal forest over time.
Awesome.
Well, it is my pleasure to introduce today's very special guest, who is Mr. Jason Lorenzon, who is an aeronautics professor at Kent State University, a practicing aviation attorney, and an FAA certified pilot and flight instructor. Now, Jason's work sits at the intersection of geospatial technology, aviation systems, and public policy, with a focus on how remote sensing, GIS, and data driven tools shape airspace management, unmanned aircraft systems, manned aircraft systems, and advanced air mobility. Jason is actively working on an across the globe flight proposal specifically to determine how geospatial technology can help determine climate trends and changes in our atmosphere, especially geospatial, atmospheric, ground, and ocean coupling, and all kinds of very cool stuff that bring all three of those fields together in one place. So, thank you for joining us today, Jason.
It's great to be here with you guys. This is exciting.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to come here on the show. And the first thing that we always talk about with our guest is when you take a map and you draw the 0 degree line of latitude and the 0 degree line of longitude on the map, where those two lines intersect is going to be the starting point of the map, or the 0 point. So the first thing we want to talk about is of what was your starting point and your 0 point? Of all the things you could have gone into, well, normally we say GIS and remote sensing, but how did it come out to be one, aviation, two, law, and three, GIS and remote sensing?
Yeah, I've certainly had a varied career. So I always wanted to be a pilot from when I was 3 and 4 years old, looking up at the skies. I had an uncle who would take me to the local Walmart when I was a kid and buy me passenger airplanes. And my oldest brother, my only brother, would do the same thing and always encouraged to do that. But I'm originally from Canada. In Canada, flying is considered a vocation, unlike here at Kent State. Some of the other aeronautical universities, you can get a degree. Canada, you really couldn't when I was going through that. I also had a cousin who was a pilot and very successful at his career, but didn't get married till much later. And my mom and dad looked at me, you don't want to be like him. You want to have a family. You want to have a stable career. I'm like, no, I kind of want to be like him. But so um, I actually had to sneak to the airport to get my private. In Canada, we still have a license. Here as a certificate. But I was sneaking to the airport, where most other teenagers are doing Lord knows what at their age. I was definitely sneaking to the Windsor Airport where I grew up. All the money I'd earned working in my dad's store. Also being a musician, I was playing in actually churches, making money each Sunday playing. I would use that money to go and spend it on expensive habits like learning how to fly. When my parents found out about it, it was kind of interesting. But being from Canada, I went into a poli-sci degree. Was trained actually as a concert pianist in my undergrad. Came to the United States, the Cleveland Institute of Music. Had another job in Florida in my first career as a church musician, but I found myself sneaking to the airport. And I got all my instrument commercial, multi-engine, certified flight instructors ratings. And I said, you know what? I've got to get somehow back to flying. Long way, kind of like a couple S turns here and there. Moved my family back from Florida up to Ohio. We didn't move in the winter. We moved in the summer, so it was a little bit bearable. But when we got back to Ohio, went to law school specifically to do that. Got my old job back. Eventually, got a job at Kent State teaching. First as a flight instructor, then eventually as an adjunct professor. After I'd won a case at the Sixth Circuit involving a pilot and their medical, which is an interesting case, and then teaching aviation law. And then in 2017, was always involved in modelers when I was younger, the model side of it, being since I was young, how do you put these things together? I always wanted to fly something like that from the ground, looking up at it. But 2017, I was actually asked to head up and be our lead faculty here at Kent State for the UAS, the drone program. So I've been doing that since 2017, establishing our program here, largely on the operational side. So we work a lot with geospatial, GIS, and remote sensing from the standpoint of how to train people how to fly in some instances of very complex aircraft. And all drones are aircraft by legal definition.
Well, I know that's how I came to know you is when I attended Kent State's class to do the training in order to get my own Part 107 certification. And I know you've been involved in not only training people for flying drones and getting to know what they need to know in order to, get the stamp of approval from the FAA, but I know you're also doing a lot of, actual flying with students, flying planes. How do you bring all those things together? Both, the aviation component of flying with students and then the aviation component of teaching people how to fly remotely as well.
So it's that's a really great question, and it's a fascinating one because all of our, again, being an attorney, being involved with laws, not only on the operational side, how do we train pilots? And a lot of what we do in the manned aircraft realm carries right over into the remote pilot. And you probably remember, Brad, when you were coming through the 3-day course, that I made a big deal that, the 107 exam, is for SUAS under 55 pounds, but a lot of that was based upon the commercial written for manned aircraft pilots and the private written. So a lot of what we do in flying is very similar. So the only big difference, and this is where kind of in my realm, where the juxtaposition of manned and unmanned comes from, a lot of the opposition actually comes from the manned aircraft pilots. And it took me a long time to explain to unmanned or drone pilots why that is. It took me a while. I know sometimes I'm a little bit slower. It takes me a little bit longer to figure things out. But it comes with the matter of perspective. And this is something I was really interested in because it was brought to my attention. Because I'm working in the realm, I'm working training students. Of course, anything that's flying and that you're, breaking the law of gravity. Law of gravity comes to the earth. I like to break the laws, and then there's always an exception. Of course, when things fall out of the sky, you have gravity, which can actually be very harmful or cause injury or threats to a person's life, or damage to property, which of course we want to avoid in all operations. But a lot of times, like if I have an emergency, and I've had several over my careers, we're on the plane. We have to actually work that emergency to have a successful outcome, to manage that emergency and to get on the ground as safely and as quickly as possible. Now, that same principle applies to drone flying. There's one major difference, and this is where I think, and our safety manager here at Kent State really brought this to my attention about 6 months ago. And his concern was that when we're doing operations, and a lot of my research is integrating what drone flying is with the national airspace system, manned and unmanned. How can we essentially coexist together? As a manned aircraft pilot, something happens, I have a vested interest. I'm actually on the plane. I have to deal with it. What happens if you're not on the plane? Do you not have that same vested interest? And I thought that was really an interesting a take on that. And I think that's something that really changed my perception of how we have to deal with the training of pilots. Yes, this is not a long time ago. These were models. One of the cases on point, the Perker cases, that was one of the legal issues. Is this thing that's really a toy? Is it an aircraft? And after the administrative law judge at the NTSB level said no, it doesn't fit definition of aircraft, actually went to the full board of the NTSB about 10, 12 years ago, and it came out pretty stringent that yes, this is an aircraft. And the FAA is more of a jurisdictional issue, that the FAA has a chance to regulate it, to enforce the laws. So, and a lot of what we do, the other thing I know I'm giving everybody a lot, this is the actual 100th anniversary year of the Air Commerce Act of 1926. And everybody comes back and forth and says, the main purpose of the FAA is for safety. I tell people, no, that's the secondary purpose, because in the United States, yes, we have a constitution. There's enumerated powers. Congress actually established, and notice I said Air Commerce Act of 1926, based on the Commerce Clause. Congress actually established our certification procedures that are still in effect today for pilots, for aircraft, for ATC. So there's a whole plethora of laws that started 100 years ago, and actually it was signed by President Coolidge on May 20th, 1926. But actually what precipitated that was the barnstormers, where there were really no regulations. And there was a very famous pilot named Bessie Coleman, African American young lady, who actually, because she was African American and a lady, could not get her pilot's license here in the United States. She
Mhm.
learned French. She went to France and got it, came back. That's just an amazing feat of itself.
Mhm.
Because in Canada I had to learn French, and that's a pretty tough language. It's a beautiful language, but it's pretty tough. But she came back here, and she was on the barnstorming that Cleveland Air Sports, where you could pay for Sunday afternoon, pay your ticket. What now? It's $20 or $100, whatever it is. Back then, it's probably a half penny or whatever it was to go in
Mhm.
and see all these wing walkers, these daredevils fly. Unfortunately, about a month before, in April of 1926, I believe it was April 14th, 15th of 1926, she actually she was flying around with her mechanic, which that's always important because they take care of it, make sure it's fit for and it's airworthy. He actually unfortunately left a monkey wrench into a control surface, and a control surface jammed, and Betsy lost control of the aircraft and crashed into the aircraft crashed into the ground with the mechanic. At that point, people were just jumping out of the aircraft. She jumped out, didn't have a parachute, and perished.
Oh,
So I
man.
think that a lot of that in her notoriety precipitated Congress to actually do something.
Mhm.
And this new invention called the airplane, air traffic, we had dirigibles, we had balloons, dirigibles being airships, uh, had to be regulated in some way, shape, or form. 100 years later, we're kind of still in the same boat, but it's also an act of commerce, and it falls underneath the Commerce Clause, and it's all about business. And think about it: every time there's an airplane accident or something happens, people don't want to fly, and those are basis of our regulations, which fits into a lot of how I train people.
That's amazing, especially that you bring the whole breadth of the law and the history and the knowledge of what accumulated here. It's not just here's a drone, fly it, just make sure it doesn't go out of sight. That you really have that whole basis of bringing all of that together along with the pilot training. And how have you felt that that's really kind of influenced the way you teach this stuff, and especially in regard to looking at public policy as well?
Well, I think the big thing is that you have to know your history. You have to know where we're coming from. You have to know where we're going to. And a lot of times, too, which is really fascinating in the UAS, the remote sensing world, which, again, in academia, Brad, I think we can agree that, we are pretty siloed in what we do. And I love cross disciplinary work. The stuff I'm doing, extends not only to geospatial, GIS, remote sensing, but there's engineering. There's all the things that, person who gets into their car or to an airplane really doesn't understand, maybe doesn't want to know. But putting all these facets and pieces to parts together, I think are really important. Understanding, one, how do we do this effectively? How do we, of course, do this safely? And how do we make sure that the art, because aviation, aeronautics is actually a combination of art and science. How do we make these elements meet so that if there's a GIS remote sensing, it may be a farm, it may be water, it might be architectural. How do we do that all successfully working together as a team? And again, bringing that breadth of knowledge together is a lot of fun for me. But the other thing that I tell people, no matter how detailed I can become, and I've been accused of speaking too much like a lawyer, being too complicated. Well, most people, it's only less than 1/2 of 1% of our population that spend any time or actually have even touched the controls of an aircraft. Less than 1/2 of 1%. So I tell all pilots, and you can see their heads, they get bigger in a classroom. And especially when I have part 107, people who haven't, like yourself, Brad, I know we took you guys out to the airport. You haven't touched the controls of an airplane, touch them. You are now an elite of an elite. And all these things, aviation's complex. But what I tell students is never lose the awe of that aircraft taking off for the first time, losing that connection to the ground, actually becoming airborne. Or if you're flying on the aircraft, this morning I had a chance to fly. I had to do my recurrent training at our airport, and on takeoff, I didn't lose that awe. Pull back on the yoke as soon as I get to a specific airspeed, and we're airborne. And you can never lose that awe that you're actually, one, breaking the law of gravity, but two, it's also that different perspective now. That because most people, 1/2 of 1% have touched the controls of an airplane, but most people spend most of their lives attached to the ground. As soon as you become airborne, 50, 100, 120 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, 20,000 feet into space, you get a much different perspective. And that's the awe that I tell people never to lose when they're in this realm. But that also gives us another opportunity of looking, especially in the GIS remote sensing geospatial area, to looking at problems in a much different perspective.
So, Jason, I really appreciate that when you comment on aviation being both an art and a science, and that's can be said for geography also. And so the intersection of aviation and geospatial technology was going to happen one way or the other. And certainly I agree that I grew up close to Aviat Aircraft in Afton, Wyoming, worked there for a number of years and was had opportunity to fly Huskies and pits. And you're right about, never losing the awe once you pull back and take off and start seeing the ground from an entirely different perspective. And so I guess one of the things that I'm interested in, and you're talking to your students, what is kind of their thought, process when they first, that first, ride when they're going to go out and, they get in the plane the first time, or when you're doing recurrent, training, you start to see the earth from an entirely different perspective. But I'm curious what you've witnessed, your students and how they've reacted over the years when they see this. And then I have a question about national airspace, but I'm curious about, kind of what your interaction has been with your students as they recognize these things that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's really, from the breadth of being an instructor since 2003. And I always get excited when I take up younger pilots, teenagers. Trained all my kids, all my children are all pilots. One's an airline pilot, one's becoming an airline pilot. Um, but it's really exciting. It's like that Christmas morning that you give your child a present, those of us who are parents, or you've received that present and you're that child. It's that magical moment that when they take off, it's like, wow. One of my beginning students years ago looked at me and said, I said, my hands are actually were in my lap at that time. I said, you did this takeoff all by yourself.
Hmm.
And, we're about 100, 200 feet above. And the smile on their face is like, I can do this. Yeah. My wife always jokes with me because she's also a pilot, but she says, she likes to call me Peter Pan, and she's my Wendy to her Peter Pan. But it's this idea that you can do that and fly, and it's that amazing thing from that first ride. Myself, sometimes working with some of our graduates here, when you get into their career, I got to fly here, I got to do this. But then you also get the pilots who are so excited, like, hey, even though I'm flying the same route, it might be, Cleveland, JFK, or whatever it is, Cleveland, New York, and they're flying this. They have most pilots will have like a 4 or 5 day schedule, but every time they get into the flight deck, every time they get airborne, that office window is very different on every flight. Why? Because we're dynamic Earth.
Hmm.
The weather keeps changing, and you can take that same route many times, but you will always see something different. I've never saw that particular landmark there. Oh, this is exciting. Oh, there's a new supermarket opening up, or a new building being built here. But it's that awe that, again, most people come back to it. They spend their life attached to the earth, but when they're up above, they're getting a much different perspective, and that's where that magic happens. That's where the smile happens, and they can do the same thing every day for the rest of their lives and never see the same thing. And I think
Hmm.
that's what makes this so attractive.
Oh, I think you're right. So that kind of leads into, I'm curious about your, you training people to use, tools like UAS for data collection, and number one, you liked you liked models, you probably saw the UAS world as it was developing. Number one, how did what was your take on it when people started first flying? We'll just call them drones for the term. But when people first started doing this, and you're like, did it click? And you say that's going to be huge. Did you expect it to go where it has gone? Did you expect it to go slower or faster? I'm curious about just the history of UAS coming into everybody's house basically, and being able to pick one up and go out and see the Earth from a different perspective.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting question because I know NASA, you know, again, a little bit of the history going back to 2012, a lot of the lobbyist groups were petitioning Congress and lobbying Congress to come up with our drone laws. You know, the Perker cases were a result because we didn't have any way of doing and enforcing drone rules.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably around after the Iraq War, Afghanistan, probably about 2005 to 2008, where really a lot of these high tech computers became smaller, but also, too, they became a lot cheaper so that the consumer could actually afford doing and creating their own aircraft. And that's what the whole idea of modelists were, right? That they could take an airplane, that they didn't have to buy an aircraft, and they could actually fly it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have that on one hand. On the other hand, I think aviation is always precedential. It's kind of like the law, meaning we have to look at the back. Back in in 2012, Congress told the FAA and NASA get together and figure out this advanced air mobility, whatever that is, and this new age, this democratization of aviation, and this is something that I've struggled with as not only an educator. Can everybody get into a plane and fly it? Some of the bigger companies think yes, they can. A couple of us are doing the Beta ALIA training. That is definitely one of their approaches. We'll have to see if that works out. But the other issue is that every time I get into an aircraft, whether it's an air transport aircraft, such an Airbus A320, or my own personal airplane, or one of the airplanes at Kent State, one of the general aviation airplanes, you're going to hit something called turbulence. And a lot of people feel very uncomfortable like that because it's not like, it's kind of like driving a car on a very bumpy, hilly road. And, your stomach goes down. You might get airsick. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that's kind of idealistic with the 2012 Act. But I think it has to have an approach in this area. And who are the people who are actually really using this technology effectively? Yes, the people who are doing the geospatial, um, the geospatial research, the GIS, the remote sensing. Furthermore, it's the first responders using this, but they're using sensors. They're using thermal cameras to capture perhaps a person who's absconding. Famous case down a couple counties south of me here in Ohio, where they actually used a drone to chase somebody who stole a car. And they found the perpetrator by using the drone, by using a thermal camera. Other firefighters I've worked with, they're using their drones to determine thermal imaging to know where the hottest part or the most dangerous part of the fire is so that they can either attack it or avoid it or mitigate their risk. So we see the smaller SUAS really starting to take hold, and probably on a really good timeline. Where I think we're going just perhaps a little too fast is the idea of drone delivery, although it's happening. Drone delivery, and of course, air taxis. I don't think people are there yet on that because we hear a lot, and this is something I do a lot of teaching on, and it's not that I have an opinion on this. Of course I do. FAA and NASA will come out and say, well, we have to have this public acceptance piece. Well, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, but I do know that we are a capitalist nation. Everything that the FAA does is based on the Commerce Clause. That's their enabling legislation. Mm-hmm. So I turn this around and I say, what is the consumer demand? And that's what I look at it. Right now, the consumer demand is definitely what geospatial research is doing, GIS is doing. There's so much in there that's so valuable. Now, that will scale up, but I think that's where the consumer, that's where the demand is, the market demand right now. And leaving it up to market supplies, yes. There's a very aggressive schedule for air taxis. I don't think we're there yet. And again, it's novel aircraft. It's aircraft that uses alternative fuels. It could be electricity. But again, I really think in that realm, in the realm of aviation, it's not revolutionary, but rather evolutionary. And I think once we have this concept, then we all know where our part is, because we agree that geography, aeronautics, it is that art and science. It is that helping each other out, multidisciplinary. But that's where the real work is being done now, and that's where the real success is. We still have a long ways to go because of the drone dominance. Even though we're working with a lot of really successful American companies, we're still not there yet with some of the technology.
Well, that was a question that I had. We talk about market demand, and we start looking, at the DJIs and of the world, and limitations that get placed, on foreign made markets, and we struggle in the U.S. or we've relied, I should say, we have the ability, but we've relied on other countries to develop this manufacturing and put these things together. One of the questions I think that I would have, for you, if I was sitting in your class, or wanting to engage with you, is what message would you share with those of us that are geospatial professionals to understand better about aviation, better about UAS? How can you help? It was the Wild West, maybe it still is a little bit. I agree with you about air taxis. We're probably not quite there, but what would what message would you give the geospatial professionals when you're talking about UAS, in particular talking about data collection, what you're just saying now, and looking at flying drones for the purpose of getting out there and not just looking at the Earth from a different perspective, but really capturing some really critical data?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris, because this is something I've definitely thought about and struggled with. One of the things I want to say is that aviation of itself is its own discipline.
Hmm.
And we talk about the democratization of aviation. I understand that, but not everybody can fly. The different professionals, the geospatial professionals, the geography professionals, because you understand what you're looking at. As an aviator, I don't, but I do understand how to fly. I do understand
Hmm.
weather patterns. I do understand turbulence. I do understand safety management systems. I do understand emergencies. What I try to tell people is that these are I'm not saying that we need to be siloed. We need to work more together. Do I understand remote sensing? Yes. Do I understand how sensors work? Yes. I know, working with Dr. Ortiz here, he has a whole lab that processes the data that some of our drone pilots, including myself, have collected for him. I don't understand what he's doing with it, but I rely on his expertise to help me out with that. And then he relies on mine to help me out, or to help him out with, actually, how do we fly a mission? What airspace are we looking at? Again, I'm doing this all the time. Geospatial experts, you guys know what you're looking for. And it's through that collaboration, cooperation, that we actually have a really strong team and much more successful outcome. What I'm seeing in the industry, and this started with real estate professionals about a decade ago, geez, I can buy a drone and I can take pictures of your house.
Hmm.
But the real estate agent was getting their Part 107. They had to, because it's a commercial operation, but they were doing it themselves. Then some of the other uh, the real estate agents that I've been working with, they will hire professional pilots to do those operations. And there is a big marketed difference in what the capture is. And also, too, the really good ones will actually hire either a pilot who knows photography, or if they're getting into really complex photography, they'll have the pilot along with a photographer working, again, the sensor being the camera on the aircraft, and then directing the remote pilot in command. This is what I need you to do. And that's what I think, that collaboration, cooperation needs to happen. Here at Kent State, we're the College of Engineering and Aeronautics. A lot of times with our engineers that I work with, I have a huge lab in the summer, but if they're an engineer and they want to work with me, they have to get their Part 107. And
Hmm.
why? Not necessarily that they're going to use it, but they have a basic understanding. But also, too, they become more marketable because they understand it. If they want to develop that skill, that they can. But it's this give and take, that it's not just one person that can do the entire operation.
Hmm.
Hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's great. So I know Brad's going to take it away from me in just a minute, but I have one other question that that I think is probably would be very interesting to our, our geospatial folks out there, but also pilots and UAS pilots as well. And that is, talking about national airspace and how air traffic is managed, how it has evolved over the years, and there's been challenges to that. But how has geospatial data, how has geospatial as this idea really influenced and helped the development of aircraft management, space, looking at traffic, and just we're looking in a 3D system here, and there's so many moving parts, and I'm interested in your expert opinion. How has geospatial changed aviation?
It's changed it, it's modified it, and it's improved it. As we begin, I'm working on something that's called dark space theory, and here in Northeast Ohio, Kent State is one of the actually it is the largest public university in Ohio. With we have the largest aircraft fleet. We have 38 aircraft, and on a day, very sunny day like today and warm day, everybody's flying.
Mhm.
And you will see that the Northeast Ohio region, and I've done maps of this, collecting data over like a 10-day period, where this is the most congested airspace in this area.
Mhm.
But that becomes important because when I develop the 3D model, I can see where these aircraft are flying now, because the National Airspace System, depending on where you're at, under case law, under regulatory law, starts at 500 feet and 1,000 feet, respectively. 500 feet under over areas that are sparsely populated, 1,000 feet over like urban areas, city areas. However, so airplanes can't fly underneath that. So you have a whole bunch of space, except for around the airport environment, where drone airways can happen. And this is where geospatial technology comes in really well. Because what am I looking at? I'm looking at from the ground up to that 400-foot AGL, above ground level area. But it's not ground to 400 feet is clear. We have vegetation, we have buildings, we have roadways, we have obstacles, we have towers. And that's where the geospatial data comes into play. Also have other things that we're looking at, and we are employing all these different products, different research models from geospatial research to incorporate in digital twins. So we can actually predict what a drone airway should look like. How can it avoid manned aircraft traffic, especially around the airport environment? So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and a lot of collaboration, cooperation between the aeronautics professionals and the geospatial researchers.
Well, Jason, unfortunately, I do see by the apple fritter shaped clock on the wall that we are just about out of time. But before we go, want to know, where can everybody find you online to find out more about all of this amazing stuff that you're doing?
So I'll give you a website. You can go to www.kent.edu. You can also Google my name, or you can email me at jloren10@kent.edu. And certainly always open to assisting people with questions and to talk further. I know each year we have a special legal symposium, which this year I believe it'll be on November 18th. It's called Droneovation. Last year we actually dealt with first responders. The year before we were dealing with actually airspace. This upcoming year we're going to be dealing with a very specific topic, working around anti-drone technology. Those drones that are really what we call non-cooperative, and seeing how ATC can deal with that. But it brings together professionals, brings together attorneys, aeronautics, aviators, aeronautics professors, engineers, and other lawyers who are practicing in the area. We had an NTSB judge up here. We had the actual FAA attorney who's in charge of drone enforcement, and a lot of really good discussions happen. So that's one way of getting actively involved with what we do here at Kent State.
It sounds good. We will put links to all of this stuff in our companion Substack, where you can find all of our show notes as well. But Jason, thank you so much for joining us here on the show today. We really appreciate you coming on. This was a great episode, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Anytime, Brad. Thank you, Chris.
And Chris, where can everybody find us online?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That was great, and so many topics there that we could probably spend a couple hours going over. But yeah, Brad, we can. I invite anybody to go over to Substack. You can see all the show notes for this show and all of our others, and you can certainly find the podcast. If you haven't subscribed, you can do so through the links there at Substack. Spatial Signals is what you'd be searching for, and then certainly all our social accounts at America View, including over on YouTube, where some great recorded content by our State View members across the country. And last but not least, our website, americaview.org. A lot of great downloadable materials there, Brad.
And as always, we'd like to thank our editor, Matt Wozniak, for making us sound good. And our theme music comes courtesy of Mr. Matthew Maxwell. Also, if you're listening to this podcast on a platform that allows you to leave a review, if you could do so, that would be great. Not only would we really appreciate it, that genuinely does help get this show out into the hands of other people. But we'll be back soon with another episode. So until then, I'm Brad Shellito.
I'm Chris McGinty.
And you keep watching the skies for those spatial signals out there.